On the evening of November 2nd, 1942, as Tokyo drowned in cold rain and distant air raid sirens echoed faintly through shuttered streets, Lieutenant Kenji Takahashi sat alone in the far end of the Naval Intelligence Bureau. His office was dim-lit only by the flicker of a single lamp and the pulsing red light of the encrypted radio decoder behind him. In his hands a packet marked, "Eyes Only, High Priority," from the consulate in San Francisco. For 2 hours he read underlined recalculated. Then he stopped moving. His fingers trembled not from cold but from comprehension. The numbers weren't propaganda, they were real. American factories, Ford, Boeing, General Motors, were scaling at speeds that defied the known rules of war. The United States wasn't just preparing for conflict, it was becoming an unstoppable engine of total war. And in that moment, Takahashi understood with brutal clarity, Japan could not win. But saying so out loud was not an option. Not here. Not under the eyes of men who believed divine wind would crush steel. Takahashi was not a fanatic. He did not worship the emperor as a god. He did not romanticize suicide charges or paper-thin zeros. He believed in supply chains, logistics, curves, and oil, and what he saw in those American reports terrified him more than any bomb ever could. To speak the truth would mean execution. To stay silent meant complicity. And so he chose the silence of survival, knowing it would cost millions their lives. This is not the story of a traitor nor a hero. It is the story of a man who saw the end before it began and chose to say nothing. And that silence became a weapon more destructive than any torpedo. The radio hissed in short nervous bursts as encrypted bursts of data scrolled across the decoding unit behind him. Lieutenant Takahashi didn't move. His eyes locked on the final column of figures long after the last signal faded into static. The memo, now fully decoded and laid bare, didn't require further commentary, only understanding. It was all there: material consumption rates, factory expansion blueprints, monthly aircraft output, fuel stockpiles, and production forecasts from across the continental United States. In his right hand he held the intelligence report. In his left, a calculator and his own handwritten comparisons. They didn't match. No, they exceeded every estimation Imperial Command had insisted upon. The American production curve was no longer theoretical, it was erupting, accelerating exponentially and in multiple theaters at once. Takahashi flipped back through his previous assessments. His handwriting looked calmer, then still anchored in the hope that the numbers might be exaggerated or that American inefficiency would drag them down. But these documents were not Allied propaganda. They came from Tokyo's own consular agents, industrial observers, and even select engineers with contacts inside American war plants. Some had been smuggled via diplomatic pouches. Others intercepted wire reports. Independent sources cross-referenced, time-stamped, and terrifyingly consistent. He did the math again. Even if Japan achieved perfect efficiency, even if every warship survived, every plane flew double hours, every soldier fought to the death, it would still be outproduced 10-1 by 1944. Japan was not fighting a war of spirit. It was trapped in a logistical nightmare against a behemoth that didn't sleep, and no one in the Imperial War Cabinet was willing to hear it. He stood slowly, walked to the tall cabinet near the window, and pulled out an older internal estimate, one that had been presented with pride. Months earlier, America will tire. Their public has no stomach for prolonged conflict. That sentence stared back at him like a cruel joke. The new reports invalidated every core assumption the war strategy had been built on. Takahashi's superiors still spoke of divine will and national honor. But here, in the silence of that office, among numbers and facts and logistical throughput charts, Takahashi saw something else: inevitability. The isolation settled in fast. It wasn't physical, but intellectual. He was surrounded by senior officers who could recite ancient poetry about cherry blossoms dying in glory, but who had never once asked how many ball bearings it took to keep a tank running. They believed in the sword. He saw the assembly line. They believed in sacrifice. He saw shipping tonnage. And while they celebrated the sinking of a single American cruiser, he calculated the rate at which the U.S., Navy could replace it faster than Japan could train the men to row a lifeboat. He thought of the engineers he'd once studied with in Nagoya, some now drafted, some vanished. Men who had doubted but stayed quiet. He thought of the colonel from logistics who had privately admitted the war was unsustainable, then died 2 weeks later in a supposed accident. The message was clear: there was no room for truth in a war built on mythology. No oxygen for rationality in a system that fed on delusion. Takahashi's hands curled into fists, not out of anger at the enemy, but at the blindness within. The empire would fall not because its soldiers lacked courage, but because its leaders denied reality. But who would he tell? Who would listen? No one. And he knew it. His knowledge was a curse without a language, a scream buried under protocol and fear. He stared at the last figure on the page, an estimate from Detroit's Packard plant retooled to produce aircraft engines at record pace. He wrote one line beneath it in pencil: "We are fighting ghosts with prayers." Then he quietly folded the reports, placed them into an envelope marked low priority, and locked them in his personal drawer, where they would remain unseen. He adjusted his uniform, stepped out into the corridor, and began preparing for the morning meeting with the Admiralty. He would speak of endurance, of national unity, of sacrifice. He would nod as the brass declared victory inevitable. And no one in that room would know that just hours before, one man had stared into the future and had already seen the empire burning. By the time Takahashi entered the central war planning chamber the next morning, the storm outside had cleared. But inside the walls of power, a darker front had settled, thick, impenetrable, and deliberate. The room was full of crisp uniforms, hollow patriotism, and dangerous certainty. Charts were unrolled, models rearranged, and speeches rehearsed. No one asked questions. No one dared. There was no space for uncertainty, here only reverence for the plan, however outdated, and the mythology that sustained it. Takahashi took his seat quietly, his expression unreadable. His mind, however, was still trapped in the numbers from last night, numbers that no one here wanted to see. When one junior logistics officer hesitantly pointed out a fuel supply discrepancy along the Mariana line, he was met not with analysis but with silence, then dismissal. "Do not spread defeatism," barked a vice admiral. "The Emperor expects resolve." The young officer nodded, eyes dim, and sat back down. He wouldn't speak again. It wasn't the first time. Just weeks earlier, Takahashi had watched a brilliant air traffic strategist named Kuroda be removed from operations after suggesting that American radar capabilities were rendering Japan's aerial doctrine obsolete. Kuroda was gone, now formally transferred to an advisory role in Manchuria, but everyone knew that meant exile, if not quiet erasure. The system didn't correct itself. It amputated anything that questioned its heartbeat. Truth in this place was a contaminant. The Imperial War Cabinet operated not as a rational command body, but as a shrine of self-reinforcing delusion. The few who dared voice concern were branded with whispers, coward traitor infected by Western thought. And always, always the same phrase came back like a prayer: "This is a sacred war. Ours is not to doubt." Takahashi learned quickly, not just what to say, but what not to notice. When reports from Burma showed unsustainable losses, the data was marked under review. When carrier production targets fell 40% short, it was labeled fluctuation. When whispers of mass starvation on remote islands surfaced, they were erased before making it past the second desk. In this ecosystem, failure wasn't punished for being real, it was punished for being acknowledged. The cruelty of the system was its elegance. It didn't need to arrest every dissenting voice. It simply made examples of a few, and the rest policed themselves. Officers became actors. Engineers became liars. Economists learned how to falsify optimism. Everyone learned the script or vanished. Takahashi kept his head down, but the weight on his chest grew heavier with each meeting. He watched as senior staff celebrated meaningless victories. He listened as they made plans to hold positions that could no longer be supplied. He heard slogans repeated with the intensity of prayer while maps bled red with lost territory. And he said nothing, because the lesson had been made clear in this empire: to be right too early was to be destroyed. One night after a classified session reviewing Pacific losses, Takahashi sat with Colonel Nitta, a logistics man with tired eyes and too many secrets. "Over tea," Nida whispered. "Do you ever wonder what would happen if we all told the truth at once?" Takahashi didn't answer. He couldn't. Nida continued, voice low and bitter. "We have men dying for an illusion, but no one dares break it. Because to shatter the dream is to die before the body." The sentence lingered with him. It haunted him more than the screams from Guadalcanal or the sinking reports from the Philippine Sea. Because it was the first time someone had said it out loud, "We are feeding men into fire to preserve a lie." And yet neither of them reported this conversation. Neither of them wrote it down. Because truth, even whispered, was dangerous. Takahashi began to understand the full horror of his position. He was no longer just a man who knew the truth. He was now part of the machinery that suppressed it. Every time he stayed silent in those meetings, every time he smiled at a victory speech he didn't believe in, he added weight to the very illusion he feared. And the longer he remained, the more the silence reshaped him. Was it survival or complicity? He didn't know. But the line blurred more with each passing day. Somewhere along the way, self-preservation had become a quiet endorsement. And that perhaps was the most terrifying truth of all, not that lies ruled the empire, but that good men had found ways to live within them. In the quiet hours, when the building emptied and the city slept, Takahashi would sit again, with his reports rewriting the same numbers, cross-checking projections he already knew were correct. Not because they would change anything, but because it made him feel less like a coward. It was a ritual of memory, a way of saying to himself, "I still see. I still know." But there was no place to speak, no ears that wanted to hear, and no language that could survive contact with the delusion. And so the truth remained locked away in drawers in minds, in men who stared at maps, knowing the end had already been written. The promotion came quietly, almost like an afterthought. A thin envelope, a stamped order, a handshake that meant everything and nothing. By early 1943, Takahashi was no longer a silent observer in the Intelligence Bureau. He was now the chief coordinator of Naval Strategic Supply, a role that placed him at the center of the war machine he no longer believed in. It was on paper a reward for competence. In reality, it was a trap disguised as honor. The system didn't silence him. It recruited him, gave him more control, more access, more chances to optimize the machinery of war he knew was mathematically doomed. His new office overlooked the Yokosuka Naval Yard, where ships crawled through dry docks like broken beasts awaiting resurrection. From here, he coordinated fuel routes, streamlined engine part distribution, reduced delays in carrier construction, and increased turnaround times on torpedo production. Every lever he pulled improved results. Every improvement gave another month of war. And every success drove a deeper wound into his conscience. He wasn't stopping the collapse. He was feeding it more efficiently, more intelligently, more invisibly. At meetings, officers applauded him. "Takahashi-san, you've reduced idle time by 37%. Thanks to you, our supply chains are running tighter than ever." They saluted his efficiency while ignoring the outcome. What good was punctuality when the destination was ruin? What value did optimization have when applied to the prolongation of death? He told himself what every dangerous mind tells itself when it becomes part of the machine. If not me, someone worse would take my place. And he believed it, or tried to. He convinced himself that by remaining he could prevent reckless decisions. He could delay catastrophic offensives. He could protect a few thousand men from being sent into hopeless firestorms. But each time he helped the system function, it only grew hungrier. And each time he kept it running, he made it harder for the world to see it was failing. Behind his back, he began to hear new titles. The ghost at the table, the man who gets things done, the spine behind the Admiralty. But none of them knew what it cost him to nod in silence as they discussed offensives he had already predicted would end in slaughter. None of them saw his hands shake under the desk as he signed another order that would send fuel to ships he knew wouldn't come back. His efficiency made the illusion look sustainable. And the longer the illusion held, the more men died believing in it. At night, he returned to his apartment overlooking the harbor. He would stare out the window as blacked-out convoys crawled toward the docks. Below, workers toiled under dim lights, building what he knew could never be built fast enough. One evening he opened a bottle of sake and whispered into the silence, "I am not saving this country. I am just slowing its funeral." There was no comfort in confession, no audience for doubt. His colleagues saw only results. The high command saw a loyal executor, and the dying saw hope in every convoy he dispatched. He had become essential to a process he no longer believed in, and yet he kept going. The justifications came in quiet waves. One more adjustment might spare a battalion. If I pull this resource here, I can reinforce a vulnerable flank. I can hold the collapse a little longer, maybe long enough for peace. But peace never came. Only more lists, more shortages, more targets, more silence. He watched junior officers come and go, some still idealistic, some already broken. He trained them, delegated to them, mentored them in methods he didn't believe in. His genius was now a weapon deployed by others, a silent bomb that left no crater, only prolonged despair. One afternoon, an older admiral clapped him on the shoulder and said, "You're the kind of man this country needs more of." Takahashi smiled, bowed, and thanked him. But inside, something withered. Because he knew the truth, this country didn't need more men like him. It needed men who would risk everything to stop the machine. But he wasn't one of them, not anymore. And as each shipment left port, as each plane launched with parts he'd helped source, as each new casualty statistic crossed his desk, he understood the shape of his legacy. He wouldn't be remembered as a traitor nor a hero, but as a man whose brilliance became fuel for a lie. And lies, when well-fed, burn brighter than truth, long enough to blind a nation, long enough to bury millions. And Takahashi, the quiet, calculating officer who had once whispered numbers into darkness, now sat at the heart of the storm, not as a resistor, but as its engineer. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly, not as a collapse, but as a dull unraveling, a missed supply deadline, a battalion stranded without fuel, a carrier delayed for repairs that would never come. By mid-1944, the cracks Takahashi had traced in whispers were widening into chasms, and every projection he had made in silence now marched into the daylight with terrifying precision. The Philippines fell faster than expected. Convoys were being hunted and torn apart by American submarines. Forward airfields went dark for lack of parts, and entire divisions vanished into jungle silence. He watched each dispatch come across his desk like the tick of a doomsday clock, not with shock, but with grim recognition. This wasn't new. This wasn't unexpected. This was everything he had foreseen, dismissed, and helped delay. And now the storm had arrived. Tokyo grew quieter as its leaders grew louder. In press conferences, ministers spoke of glorious setbacks and strategic repositioning. In private, they argued over rationing, scraps, and hiding the full extent of the loss. But Takahashi no longer needed the maps or models to understand what was happening. It was everywhere, in the haunted stares of wounded officers returning from the Southern Front, in the silence of radios, where battalions used to report in the deepening panic behind ceremonial words. The illusion was collapsing, and yet the machine still turned. He attended meetings where men shouted about final offensives, sacred honor, and divine intervention. They plotted new deployments with forces that no longer existed. They redrew lines with weapons that hadn't been manufactured. Takahashi stood in those rooms, surrounded by ghosts, with medals watching them pour fuel on ashes and call it victory. He wanted to speak, to scream, to tell them this was suicide wrapped in tradition. But what was left to say? The time for warnings had passed. He had given his silence in the years when it might have mattered. Now his voice, even if raised, would be drowned by the roar of collapse already underway. Reports began arriving faster, and each more catastrophic than the last. Saipan lost. Leyte annihilated. American bombers soaring over cities once thought untouchable. Oil reserves dipped below critical thresholds. The Empire's Air Force, once a feared shadow across the Pacific, now choked on fumes, unable to take off. Entire fleets sat idle steel giants, moored in harbors, with no fuel, no pilots, no future. And still the orders came, Reinforce counterattack hold. But hold what Takahashi stopped answering his superiors, with conviction. He gave them numbers they wanted not because he believed them, but because it no longer mattered. They were asking for lies, and he had mastered their language. Somewhere inside, the voice of his younger self whispered that this too was complicity, that even in collapse, silence had weight. He spent long hours, alone, again, not with projections, but with casualty lists. Thousands, then tens of thousands, then entire columns, labeled status unknown. Cities were vanishing not in defeat, but in fire. Okinawa, Naha, and soon he feared Tokyo itself. American bombers now flew by day, unhindered, unchallenged. The skies no longer belonged to Japan. They belonged to the future, and it was coming with thunder. At night, the capital darkened in blackouts, but the flames from distant coastlines still glowed on the horizon. He would stand at his office window, watching the red flicker in the distance like the pulse of a dying heart. Somewhere below, mothers wrapped their children in blankets they could no longer heat. Trains ran less often. Factories echoed half-empty. Rice disappeared. And yet in the war ministry, they spoke of miracles. One evening, a young aide brought him an emergency memo, a proposed operation to retake a strategic airfield using outdated munitions and a decimated infantry division. Takahashi read it once, then dropped it into the trash without a word. The aide hesitated, then asked, "Sir, should we not send an objection?" Takahashi looked at him, not with anger, but with a kind of mournful clarity. "There's no one left to listen," he said, and he meant it. The truth was no longer a weapon. It was a corpse. He had carried it too long, hidden it too well, and now when its revelation might have pierced the veil, it lay buried under the rubble of decisions made too late. He had once believed he could buy time, slow the collapse, shape the end. But the end had come anyway, in burning coastlines, empty barracks, and starving children. And his hands once covered in ink and data now felt coated in ash. The silence that had once protected him was now his prison. His legacy would not be one of resistance nor betrayal, but of brilliance wasted in service of a doomed lie. He had not lied with words, but with compliance, with performance, with silence when truth was oxygen. And now, Japan stood on the precipice of ruin, not because no one knew, but because the few who did like him had chosen to survive rather than confront. And as the city braced for the next wave of fire, Takahashi sat in the dark listening to the distant hum of engines, the sound of prophecy fulfilled too late to matter. The war ended not with a final battle, but with a silence so complete it felt unnatural. After the fires, after the cities had turned to dust, after the emperor's voice broke through every radio surrendering a dream that had already been dead for months, Takahashi stood on the rooftop of a bombed-out government building when the news reached him. He didn't cheer. He didn't mourn. He simply stood there staring at the horizon as ash drifted across a sky that no longer belonged to gods or generals. The silence was not peace. It was the sound of accountability arriving too late. Weeks later, he was taken into Allied custody, not as a prisoner of war, but as an intelligence asset. The Americans had files on him. They knew his role. They knew what he had done, and more damningly, what he had known. In sterile rooms, lined with fluorescent lights and folding chairs, he answered their questions one by one. Yes, he had read the projections in 1942. Yes, he had calculated the collapse. Yes, he had known the war was unwinnable. No, he had never shared that conclusion with anyone in power. No, he had never attempted to sabotage the machine. No, he had never raised his voice. He simply optimized it and watched it grind millions into the earth. The interrogators were not angry. They were clinical. One, an older American colonel with gray at his temples, said quietly, "You were probably the smartest man in the building." Takahashi looked him in the eye. "Then, I was the most dangerous." It was not defiance. It was confession. Word spread. Journalists began calling him the man who knew. Academics later praised his post-war writings, citing his warnings as hauntingly accurate. He was invited to conferences, memorials, strategy forums. They called him measured, brilliant, even brave, though never too loudly for fear it might tarnish the image of untainted resistance. But no medal came, no pardon, because even as the world tried to box him as a tragic figure, Takahashi knew the truth. He hadn't failed to see the fire. He had failed to shout before it consumed the house. In private, he wrote late into the nights. Not books for the public, not apologies, but recollections, sentence after sentence scrawled in black ink, not for fame or legacy, but to exercise what memory refused to bury. In one journal he wrote, "The first time I lied was by omission, the second by calculation, the third by silence. After that I lost count." The world wanted clarity, a story with villains and heroes. But his story was a corridor of locked doors, none opened, none kicked in, just walked past in quiet dread. And now, all that remained was the echo of what he hadn't done. Sometimes, he was approached by younger officers, students, reformers. They asked him what he would have done differently. Should you have spoken up? Could one voice have changed anything? Was survival worth the cost? He never answered directly. He would pause, nod, and say only this: silence does not protect you. It simply delays your punishment. For years, he lived in the ruins of a country trying to pretend it had always known better. But he had been inside the rooms where truth was outlawed. He had watched men build catastrophe with conviction. And he had helped them not because he believed, but because he was efficient. He had become the engineer of inertia. His greatest fear wasn't being remembered as a coward. It was being remembered at all, because to be remembered meant the world might forget what he really was. A man who watched the truth die in real time and chose survival over defiance. In his final manuscript, never published, he wrote, "There are two kinds of evil in war. The first is loud bombs, bullets, commands to kill. The second is quiet, a report unsigned, a warning unspoken, a truth buried. The second is what I carried. The second is what I became." He died quietly in a small apartment in Yokohama, surrounded by files he never finished organizing. His name faded slowly into academic footnotes and whispered references. Some say he was a visionary. Others say he was a coward, but perhaps both are true, because the legacy of Takahashi is not in what he built, but in what he allowed to continue. And the question he leaves behind, carved in silence, sharper than any blade, is this: if you see the fire and do nothing, are you not also holding the match? He was never tried for war crimes. There were no tribunals for silence, no courtroom for the failure to speak. Takahashi faded from public memory as the new Japan rose from the ashes, modern, forward-looking, determined to forget. But in the quiet corners of military archives and intelligence case files, his name lingered, not as a traitor or a monster, but as something far more unsettling. The man who knew and chose not to act. His story is not comfortable. It offers no redemption arc, no heroism in disguise. It is the slow suffocation of conscience beneath layers of logic and duty. He did not build the fire, but he kept the machines running as it spread. He sharpened the tools that others used to dig the graves. And when it was all over, he lived not proudly, not freely, but deliberately carrying the weight of every decision he didn't make. History often glorifies the brave or condemns the wicked. But it rarely knows what to do with those like him, the capable, intelligent men who see clearly and remain still. Yet these are the ones who enable the machinery of destruction to grind on without resistance. They are the cogs that think the gears that hesitate, but turn anyway. Takahashi left behind no monument, no statue, no grave visited by flowers. Only a question, haunting and unfinished, scrawled in the margins of his final notebook. Is it enough to survive history? If you did nothing to stop it, that question now belongs to us. And in every age, in every system that demands silence, someone will have to answer it.